So again, thank you very much for having me here. I want to start with this slide. A lot of people ask, will we continue to need testing? I don't want to go into detail of this, but what I'm showing here is that this virus isn't over. It's not done with us. And as much as I would like to say that it is, it's very unlikely to be. What I'm showing on the left is the seasonality of these viruses. Year after year after year, they spike in October and November, and then they fall off in January and February. And it's essentially exactly what we've seen this year. All I've done on the right side there is taken the New York Times data for this virus, and I've overlaid on top of it the 10-year average for seasonal beta coronaviruses, which this virus is one of. Well, it's not one of the seasonal ones, but it is a beta coronavirus. So this is just to say that I think everything we can do today to prepare us to not have to close things down this fall is just absolutely essential. And I wish, that what happened last fall could have been mitigated, but we have an opportunity now for this fall. So testing has been all about personal health in terms of our regulatory landscape and the way that we have evaluated it, the way that the media has covered it. Despite intuitively everyone understanding at this point that testing is a needed public health tool, we continue to recognize it and measure it based on medical personal health metrics on the left side. But what we really need for this pandemic is population health metrics to evaluate what is the kind of test we need. And while we have surveillance testing, especially in a place like Boston, other areas where we have wastewater surveillance, we have being able to monitor trends in cases as part of our surveillance. But what I want to talk about is on the right side here. This is the most powerful form of testing, but yet is one of the least used today still, which is screening for people on a routine basis, either entrance screening, which is as it sounds, you want to test people before they enter into a space in order to keep that space on the other side as COVID-free as possible, or public health screening, which is about keeping that R value, the reproductive number of this virus, below 1, so that outbreaks just can't emerge, so that even if you get some blips of cases, outbreaks will stay down, and if there are outbreaks already going, they will die down. And I want to show a little bit about how that can work. But first, like I said, testing has been all about diagnostic medicine. And so the usual priority order and this is what everything has been focused on, is getting the most sensitive test. And if it's not the most sensitive test, we have said that it's not worthwhile relative to the PCR test. What I'm going to show is that the PCR test, that comparison is the wrong test, and it just won't. Laboratory-based PCR testing will not stop transmission. And so we need tests to stop transmission to be very fast so that they can work as entrance screening. We need them to be frequent, because as I'll show, if you're not testing frequently, you're not stopping transmission. And then of course they need to be accessible and equitable and inexpensive. So this is what the viral load looks like inside of a person. And first thing I want you to know is that on the days, that's days since exposure. On the y-axis is a logarithmic curve. And so this isn't a linear curve. So that means that the vast majority of all the viral load is going to be on the top end of this curve. But what I'm really wanting to show here is that after people get exposed, there's a period of time, usually 2 to 5 days, when no test turns positive. They're all negative. But then the virus starts growing very fast. It is an exponentially growing virus inside of us. So the PCR will turn positive at around, in this case, around 1,000 copies per milliliter. That's the limit of detection for most PCR tests. And that's the viral load that somebody might have in them at one time. The antigen test will stay negative, and these really fast, rapid antigen tests will still be negative. But in about 15 hours, both tests will be positive. And then it's only after that people really start transmitting. 99% of all of the virus somebody has in their nose is present in just this little tip of time here between, say, day 6 and 8 or so, relative to exposure time. And very quickly, the body starts killing off the live virus, but the PCR will stay positive for weeks. and PCR continues to stay positive on average between 20 and 30 days. So while you only have this very short window of transmission, it's maybe 3 to 5 days where people are really transmitting any virus, the PCR continues to be positive. And this has led to massive confusion about these rapid tests not being sensitive enough to catch transmissible people, when really it's just that it's not that the rapid tests are not sensitive, it's that the PCR is simply not specific to the contagious period. And so the only way to catch people in this little period of time when they're highly infectious is if you're doing frequent testing. The moment you have a PCR test take 2 or 3 days to return back, even if you catch somebody in this window, by the time you get the result back, they're going to have done most of their shedding. So this is why PCR laboratory testing has failed us in this pandemic so far, for the most part, unless you're doing very frequent and ideally within 24-hour rapid turnaround time, which of course, Massachusetts and New England have been lucky to enjoy from the Broad. So this is an example. What I want you to focus on just is the left side of this for right now, these two scenarios. On the top, this is an example of why speed matters so much in school-based testing. Or this could be businesses or anything else. This is entrance screening. So what I'm showing here is two examples. In both the top and the bottom, you have 5 infectious people walk into a school or a building. On the top, you have 100% sensitive PCR testing, but it has a 2-day delay before the return of results. So it's got a 48-hour return of results delay by the time the lab results get back. What that means is that those 5 people who are infectious and walk in on day 1, they will be detected, but before they get detected, they've spent what we call in epidemiological terms, 10 person days walking around infectious. 5 people walking around for 2 days is 10 person days being infectious before being discovered. In those 2 days, those 10 person days, you might have 8 new people infected and potentially end up having to quarantine 20 or 25 or so people based on that. So that's 200 to 300 person days getting quarantined as a result, and 8 new infections. On the other hand, with a lower sensitivity test on the bottom, you have those same 5 kids walk into school or into a building, but you immediately capture 4 out of the 5 of them. It's an 80% sensitive test. So you miss 1. That missing 1 is not relative to the above case. You only have 2 person days walking around infectious. So although you're using a less sensitive test, it's the speed of results allows you to immediately capture 4 of those people, pull them out of circulation, and you only have 1 person walking around for those 2 days. The first day is probably low levels of virus load, which is why they weren't detected. And then maybe they go on and infect 1 or 2 additional people and send 4 others to quarantine. But ultimately what this is showing is a very simple thought experiment where a lower sensitivity but rapid test is worlds better, always, than a 2-day delayed PCR test. This is the basic math of it. And I've designed this slide just to point out why this is the case. We can use mathematical models. I won't go through how all of this is done, but the point of this slide here is we have different programs where we're asking how many infections are removed from the population as relative to no testing scenario. So you can just look on the right graph here, is really the easier one to look at. It does not matter which type of test you're using. If you're using the high sensitivity or a low sensitivity test, what drives the number of infections that are removed from the population is the frequency. You could be using the best test in the world, but if you're doing it weekly or every 2 weeks, it's not going to capture most of the cases, or maybe weekly will, but every 2 weeks definitely won't. And this is assuming that it's immediate turnaround time for these tests for both of them. But every day or every 3 days is going to pretty much, it's going to stop essentially all outbreaks from persisting. And at the same time, so you have the same frequency bins, but now we can layer on top of it in this model, what are the effects of the speed? The point of this is just to really drive home this message that the moment a test is taking 2 days to return, which is sort of the right side of each of these frequency bins, the 2-day return of results is just too slow to stop transmission. If you want to stop transmission, it has to be, the best case scenario is immediate, 15 minutes to under an hour. Any rapid test that can be performed and resulted in less than an hour is a very powerful test. It allows you to do things you could never do with PCR laboratory testing. Getting a test within 24 hours is still good, but not nearly as good as within an hour. But the moment you go to a 2-day return of results, and we didn't even think to model a 3 or 4 or 5-day return of results, you essentially lose all of the benefit of the test to stop transmission. This is to show why testing, if your goal is to stop an outbreak, testing does not need to be 100% effective. I've taken an extreme example. Well, on the red curve here, I've taken a very normal example where the R naught is 1.3, which means that for every 100 people that are infected, 130 go on to become infected. So that's an R naught of 1.3. That's where this virus has been sitting for most of this pandemic. Of course, recently we've seen a decay, but I'm worried we'll see an increase again. That means that after 3 to 4 weeks of this, or 4 to 5 weeks of this, 100 people per day go on to become 600 new people per day. That's at the base case scenario that we've been dealing with. On the other hand, if you have 100 people just go on and infect 90, most people, if you're not versed in epidemiological terms, you'd think that's a failing program. If 100 people go on to infect 90 people, that sounds to most people like that's a failure. But the point is to not necessarily stop every single case, but to stop every single outbreak from persisting. In this case, we have 100 people. If they go on and still infect 90 people, then after 4 to 5 weeks, instead of having 600 new infections, we only have 40 new infections. This is the power of exponential growth and decay. All we have to do is have 100 people infect 90, and you will stop all of the outbreaks from emerging, and you will tackle the outbreaks that are existing. So even the most basic of frequent rapid testing could get 100 people to know that they're infected in time to act and isolate themselves, and have only a new 90 people get infected based on that. Ultimately, that will tackle the outbreaks. We've shown this now in a more robust sort of way, but essentially what this is showing is about how long it would take to tackle the epidemics that we're seeing. So if we start a frequent testing program in Massachusetts at week 0 in this case, when we already have a lot of people who have been infected, we're at 4% prevalence in this case, and we start a testing program where let's take this small dotted blue line here. We could have 50% of people completely refuse to use a test in the state. But if we had 50% of people in the state test themselves every 3 days, we would go from massive surges in cases to having the epidemic controlled in weeks. Now we've already been on the downslope. So what this means is that if we could get, say, 50% participation and test people weekly or every 3 days, that's enough to stop outbreaks from re-emerging in the fall and re-emerging this summer with variants. It is the frequency of the testing program that will keep R below 1 and allow outbreaks to be suppressed and allow us to stop outbreaks across the state from persisting. So if we're looking at what are the attributes for different tests, we need to look at what is the attribute for a public health test meant to stop transmission. A public health test that's meant to stop transmission is one that we want to be specific only for contagious virus. We don't want to isolate people who are no longer contagious. That is a net negative for public health. We only want to isolate people who are contagious and need to be isolated. The PCR test is not specific for that. It will continue finding people as positive for weeks after they have been transmissible. We want it to be highly sensitive for contagious virus. These rapid tests are that. We want it to be able to use frequently and with fast turnaround time results. The point of this is to show that the lab-based PCR that everyone has been putting tons of effort into, huge dollars, enormous logistical chains, it is just not the right public health test. It doesn't fit really any of the bill any of the pieces that we actually need for a public health test. Meanwhile, we have these simple simple lateral flow rapid antigen tests that are so simple. They look like little pregnancy tests, but much cheaper. Now, these things these fit essentially all of these tick boxes. So if we want to, vaccination is coming about, and we have to be very aware that this is vaccines are going to be what is really the major component to our efforts in the coming year. But rapid testing to suppress outbreaks is going to improve our vaccination strategies. It's going to buy us a lot of time as we wait to get everyone vaccinated in the state and across the US and the world. And rapid testing is only going to become more and more and more effective as more and more people are vaccinated. The last thing we want is for new mutant strains, which probably will happen, to come around, and most of the world is not getting vaccinated anytime soon. So it's very likely that new strains are going to continue popping up. We're already seeing these strains evade immunity. We have to have backstops. We have to have other ways to stop spread for this process for us to sort of keep everything open over the coming year. If we don't do that, we're really putting ourselves in a bad position, and rapid tests are a way to put us in a better position to be able to deal with these outbreaks. So if we're wanting to do population screening across the state, if we're really wanting to have a statewide program that is able to suppress outbreaks at large, getting tests into people's homes is an absolutely effective way to do it. We've surveyed Americans, and we found that 86% of Americans want to use tests in their homes. It's totally bipartisan, and people want and will use these tests. If we want to keep our schools and workplaces safe in a more sort of heavy-handed way, then entrance screening is a way to go. And we can get these tests at the entrance of schools on a frequent basis, workplaces, retail offices, all of these different things that have been shut down for a year now, or in limited sort of openness. We can use these tests to make the other side of that entrance to the store or the school 95% safer than it otherwise would have been. I'd be lying if I said it's 100%, but 95% is really, really good relative to what we're doing. And it is enough to stop any outbreaks from persisting, to stop schools that have a couple cases from having to shut down. So this is the type of testing that I think we can really use to open back up. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of confusion. Our FDA is still comparing rapid antigen tests to the PCR. As I've already said, the PCR is just not specific for the contagious period, which means that depending on which lens you want to look at it, it either looks like the rapid test is not sensitive enough, or that the PCR test is not specific enough. For medicine, the rapid test is not sensitive enough. For public health, the PCR test is too sensitive. It is simply not the right test. It's not specific for the contagious period. And unfortunately, our FDA has officially deprioritized and rejected numerous of these based on this flawed review process of rapid tests. They are essentially not an agency meant to evaluate a public health test. Their charge is evaluating a medical diagnostic test. And this has led to a lot of confusion and delays in getting these tests out to the public. We've looked very closely with other economists at Harvard and elsewhere at what are the economic benefits of a national rapid testing program, and in Massachusetts. In general, I mean, the short story is that the economic benefits are massive. If we can just shave off a few days of being closed down and prevent a few days of being closed down as a result of rapid tests, it more than pays for itself for a full year. For the entire country, a rapid testing program would probably cost around $20 billion for a full year. So these are extremely conservative estimates of 25 billion additional dollars saved and 60,000 deaths averted. Probably it would have been much more if this was a year ago or last summer, and we still have a chance to prevent spread this year. Like I mentioned, 86% of Americans said that they would, in fact, use these tests. There's essentially broad approval of testing for entrance point screening people want to feel safer. They want these tests. They want to use them for entrance screening. They really want them in their homes. This is something that Massachusetts could work to do, for example. Even if the FDA is not fully getting on board, we can think about ways to bring our state sort of to the front of this and really push these forward in a meaningful way. It's one of the most bipartisan types of programs we could think of. You know, we've talked to congressional members on both sides of the aisle, the federal government, and it's extremely strong support on both sides. So there's a number of different programs that are being tried and trialed. New York State is trialing pop-up rapid testing sites for asymptomatics. They're, you know, unfortunately, the cost is high for the type of test they're using. We would like to see that at like $4 per test, if not lower, through frequent pooled testing that could be actually done rapidly right there on the site. We're seeing a massive program in San Francisco has been just astoundingly positive and beneficial to stop spread. And that has people coming from all over the city to use that one site. So it's been hugely successful. But we're starting to see an increase in number of public schools and schools abroad. The UK, for example, has a massive national rapid antigen testing program that they're rolling out. And beginning this week, they're providing free at-home rapid tests to all schools and residents and businesses. So it's becoming a hugely important component to many countries and many states' reopening plans. These tests can reopen schools. I feel very confident in that. These are the type of tests that will identify people when they're infectious. Twice weekly testing to help prevent spread from continuing even when cases enter a school. Getting twice weekly testing into a school would stop spread from continuing even when a case does enter. The nice thing about rapid tests is that it doesn't have to just be twice weekly testing. If you start to see cases, you can say, okay, there's cases. Let's have that school test daily for the next 5 days and really squash the outbreak before it even gets a chance to start. It is one of the major benefits of having these simple paper strip tests available is that schools can use them in a dynamic way. And so if you start to see cases, you increase the cadence of testing. If there's not been any cases in a month or two, maybe you can move down to weekly testing or just have some other system set up to be able to survey. And if you start to see cases again, then you bring the testing back up. It can be a dynamic process. It doesn't have to be some static process for each school. So I want to stop there, and I'm very happy to take any questions.